since we're on the topic of your book, there was actually one episode in here that I thought was very interesting. Well, I'll have you, since I have the author here, I'll have you read it,
Sure.
and then we'll discuss it on the page. I bookmarked it. You're on these two paragraphs on page 148 for those of you following along at home.
Now, what's interesting, Dustin, is ever since, and this book was published back in 2015, so it's been out for about 5 years. It's still very relevant to your viewers and readers, those of you who would like to get a perspective on what life is like as an immigrant in the United States. So it's still very relevant, but it's been 5 years, and I say that to say I tend not to go back and reread my work. Once I published it, once it was out there, I was done with it. So thank you for opening up that scab and that wound. All right.
You're welcome.
So here we go. My interaction with Troost Avenue would not end there. During my third year at UMKC, my soccer buddies and I happened to be driving along Kansas City's infamous racial border. We were heading back from an indoor soccer game in the north part of town, heading back to UMKC's bulk of campers. In the car were my 3 soccer teammates and a young lady from Europe who happened to be our unofficial cheerleader. As we approached the school, the young lady turned to my friend from Mexico and said, "I can't stand Black people." Everyone in the car went silent. And very quickly, she turned to me, the only Black guy in the car, and said, "Not you. You are different from them. You are practically white." Everyone in the car broke out in laughter, but I remained puzzled by what I had just heard. In order to keep the peace, I chuckled softly and looked outside the car window, observing my fellow Black brothers and sisters who were lined up waiting at the bus stop as we happened to drive past them. Did this young European friend of mine dislike Black people? Or did she despise folks of lower economic status than hers? Only time will tell. Her statement and my interaction with these guys made me feel like a sellout. That was hard to read, Dustin. It's hard to read. These are my own words, and it's just hard to read.
It was hard to read when I read it, because I know you well, and as we were talking before this, turned out I know the young woman too. So yeah, it was hard to read, and since I know you, I could, even if I didn't know, I'd be able to empathize and kind of feel the pain that you were getting across there. But as I reflected on that later on, I thought that there's actually some hope in that story. So if you want to kind of look at it from another angle.
Sure.
I know it was hard for you to read. It was hard to hear it again too.
Mm-hmm.
But she said, "You're not like them.
Mm-hmm.
You're." What were words like? It's like you're white.
She said you're practically
white.
Yeah.
So
and for your viewers, come on, I'm as dark as they come. I'm a dark chocolate brother, and I'm proud of it.
Heard it here first. But what do you think she meant by that?
Well, what I assume in African Americans, Black folk, whatever term you want to use, those that reach a certain educational level, those that reach a certain economic standing, they tend to be perceived as non-Black. And where I find that troubling, it is almost like because I was playing soccer and I was hanging out with them and I was in college and I was enunciating words a certain way, saying words a certain way, I was going by my English name, John, at the time. In my mind, what she was doing was not acknowledging my Blackness, my Africanness, if that's even a word. I just made that up.
It is now.
It is now.
It'll be on, it's on dictionary.
There you go.
It will be by the time I get home.
I love that. She was whitewashing it, literally, by saying, "You're practically white, you're not black. A better way that conversation could have gone, and I don't think there's any better way, because she's saying this in reference to seeing black folk standing by the bus stop and saying, I don't like them, but I like you. The question we need to ask is, why doesn't she like them? Nobody puts themselves in their own circumstances for the most part. We are creatures of our environment. We respond to our environment. I could have been one of those people at the bus stop. I'll tell you why I wasn't. Because I had a mother who barged through my door a year or two earlier than that, saying, you got to go to college. I come from a college-educated home. My father's got a bachelor's degree in engineering. My mother's got a master's degree in environmental science. My sister is a medical doctor trained in Russia and now working back on the continent of Africa. So all of these environmental things that I had nothing to do with allowed me to be the person that I am today. And for her to fail to recognize that tells me where we go wrong as a country and as a society.
You think what would be like the most charitable reading of what she could have said if you wanted to be even nicer than you were? If you said, maybe when she said you're white, she recognized you, maybe not whitewashing you, but recognized you as an in-group, as part of an in-group.
You know,
Well, they were kind of the out group.
You know what? I've never looked at it that way. And I would assume that consciously, and again, here we are, we're talking about somebody we both know. Consciously, I think that's what she was doing. She was bringing me into the group, letting me know you're one of us, which is welcoming at the time. You know, these are my friends. You see me as part of the group. What's troubling is why was that group of individuals that we were driving past that were predominantly African American, why did she choose to see them as the out group? You know, and that's where, you know, no hard feelings to this individual. We were in our early 20s. Maybe that person's not even the same person today. But that sentiment is shared by a lot of people in this city, in this country, where I learned this from a book that I read that talks about the phrase uplift suasion. And suasion comes from the word persuade, where Black people are only good enough when they uplift themselves. It's almost like you have to uplift yourself economically, educationally, to persuade white folk to bring you in the group, when we should be embracing our brothers and sisters just the way they are. When I look at everyone creates in groups and out groups. Most people do it on economic terms. So to give her some grace, maybe she was thinking, all of us in this car are college students. All of us come from middle class backgrounds, whether it's from different continents. So we're one group. But the problem with that analysis, there was still a tinge of racism. Why did she have to say you're practically white? That could have gone without saying. Just, I don't like those guys, but you know what? Everyone in this car is cool with me. That could have been received a little bit differently. And I just think, as a society, in order for us to do better, we need to get to the point where we embrace and acknowledge everybody for who they are. Dustin, you're cool with me, you're my friend, because of Dustin, the unique characteristics you have. When you and I traveled together in Boston, and I got to learn about you and your family, and we drank a bunch of Sam Adams. That was some good times. And those were expensive beers, by the way. Very expensive. I learned about you as a person, forgetting about your background, where you grew up, whether you grew up on the Missouri side or the Kansas side, that didn't matter. I saw you as a human being. And I know, in being your friend over these years and your former coworker, you've seen me the same way. Yes, I'm from Africa, but that's not my entire story. That's not the entire package. There's a human being there. And I would like to assume that that young lady has reached that level of understanding, and she did that being young and immature. But you have to see people for who they are. Peel off the layer of race and see them for who they are. Meet them where they are. Sorry to sound professorial.
No, I think that's kind of what one of the points was trying to get at, or see if you were there too. I think right now we are, fortunately, it's 2020, and we decided to draw a bunch of battle lines. And the more you parse it out, the more obvious it gets that we can only get along as if we see each other as individuals, and get past these, frankly, kind of arbitrarily drawn lines, and really see each other for as the individuals. I think that was a lot of what were America's founding principles, even if they weren't carried out perfectly. But I'm worried that we're losing that. But the other part was the in-group part. And I'm wondering if another way to get past all these divisions is if somehow she had her in-group, and it might have just been the people in the car. But if there's a way to expand the in-group out, to include everyone in America, obviously without an out-group, there can't be an in-group, but for the purposes of not burning this country down, I think it needs to be drawn out, because circles need to go wider than your class or your race or where you're from. We need to figure out how to be truly inclusive. How do we include everybody, or a lot more people into the in-group? Do you have?
Absolutely. I love what you just said, Dustin. And I hope that's a piece that your audience will really tune in and hone into and zone into, because what you just said is exactly my governing philosophy. You know, the best way I could piggyback on what you said was when I served as the director of the Bruce R. Watkins Cultural Heritage Center, a center that was built in 1989 to celebrate African-American culture and history, and to also celebrate the life of Mr. Bruce R. Watkins. He was one of the first African-Americans elected to the city council here in Kansas City. And I was fortunate to serve as the director of that building for 3 years. One of the best conversations I had was with a volunteer historian, an older African-American male who is deceased now. His name was Joe Lewis Maddox. He comes into my office and says, "Hey, I got a question for you, Mr. Director." And he, again, at the time, Joe Lewis may have been in his late 60s, early 70s, and I was in my early 30s. And he says, "I got a question for you." And I said, "What's the question, sir?" He said, "Now that you're this fancy director with your fancy office, the question is, can Black people in America succeed by themselves?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What are you getting at?" He said, "Well, let me put it to you this way. Did you make it this far by yourself, with Black hands, Black help only?" And I sat back, Dustin, and I said, well, without answering that question, I told him, without answering directly, I told him, you know what? If you're trying to get me to say, how can Black people fix themselves? The answer is simple. Black people need to do for themselves, by themselves, for themselves. Forget white folk, let's fix ourselves. Let's support each other. Let's lift up Black-owned businesses. Let's marry within the same group. I gave him the answer that I thought he was looking for. Again, this was an older African-American man. He was here during the Civil Rights era. So I'm trying to impress him with my Blackness by saying, we got to be pro-Black and forget the others. You know, we're talking about groups here in circles. And he looked at me and said, "Look at that degree on the wall." And I had my master's degree on the wall. He said, "Where'd you get that from?" I said, "Well, University of Missouri, Kansas City." He said, "Who educated you? Who were your professors?" I said, "Majority of them were white." He said, "Okay, what about your bachelor's degree? Who educated you?" I said, "Again, white folk." He said, "Who's your supervisor? You're a director of this building, but you report to somebody. Who is that person?" I said, "It's a white man and a white woman." He said, "Did you ever get scholarships?" I said, "Yes." "Who gave them to you?" "Do you remember the scholarship committee?" I said, "Majority of the people in the committee were white folk." He said, "So you mean to tell me, here you are," at the time it was 2017 or 16, he says, "Here you are saying Black people need to do for themselves when You have attained your level by getting help from people who don't look like you. And he pretty much chastised me and said, in order for us to move forward, we need each other. It's hard to do things exclusively by one group. And what he was trying to say is what you said, is expanding that circle. And he was right. And I think about my life today and my friends, and I think about how I've been enriched. As a proud African immigrant, my life has been enriched by Black folk in this country, by white folk, by straight people, people who are gay, people who are Hispanic, people who don't look like me. Some do, some don't. Some people speak English with a certain accent, some others don't. My life is better off because I personally have expanded my group, my circle, and my life is better off. I think I have progressed better. Economically, I think I've even done better because I have opened myself up to others. Now, I'm still pro-Black, but I've expanded my my in-group, and I'm better off for that. So I think if we can get people to understand that we need each other more than we understand, we would be better off.
I don't want to deny pluralism, but there could be pluralities within a larger circle.
Right.
Not that I needed the last word, but
Right. No,
just
you,
clarify.